Operation Midnight Climax. Let's get right into it. In 1954, the CIA did something that sounds too absurd to be real. They ran brothels, not to catch criminals or gather intelligence on foreign spies. They ran brothels to drug unsuspecting men with rainbow papers and watch what happened through two-way mirrors. This operation was called Midnight Climax, and it was part of the larger MKUltra program, the CIA's attempt to develop mind control techniques during the Cold War. The man running this operation was George Hunter White, a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent working as a CIA contractor. White was a decorated former OSS agent from World War II, known for his aggressive tactics and heavy drinking. The CIA paid him $15,000 a year, which is around $140,000 in today's money, plus operational expenses, and White took full advantage of those expenses. The primary safe house was located at 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill neighborhood. The CIA decorated it to look like an upscale bordello. Velvet wallpaper, Toulouse-Lautrec prints on the walls, red lighting, explicit artwork, and a fully stocked bar. But the real feature was hidden. Behind the bedroom mirrors was an observation room where CIA agents would watch and record everything that happened. Here's how it worked. The CIA placed women on their payroll as consultants, paying them $100 to $200 per session. These women would approach men in bars and on the streets of North Beach, then bring them back to the apartment. The men thought they were visiting a prostitute's home. Once there, the women would prepare drinks spiked with rainbow papers, typically 40 to 200 micrograms. The men had no idea they'd been dosed. While the men were having sex, often while experiencing terrifying hallucinations, George Hunter White sat behind the two-way mirror, drinking martinis from a pitcher. He'd smoke cigars and take notes on a clipboard, watching these men lose their minds. According to his own diary, White thought it was, quote, fun, fun, fun. The program ran for 9 years, from 1954 to 1963. Several hundred to over 1,000 men were drugged and filmed without their knowledge. The victims were specifically chosen because they couldn't report being drugged without admitting they'd been soliciting prostitution. Many were married. The CIA tested rainbow papers, mescaline, scopolamine, sodium pentothal, and various combinations of substances. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra files as the Watergate scandal broke and congressional investigations loomed. An estimated 80 to 90% of the program's documents were destroyed. What we know comes from financial records that were misfiled and survived, George Hunter White's personal diary, and testimony from the 1975 Church Committee hearings. George Hunter White died in 1975, never prosecuted. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the head of MKUltra, retired in 1973 and died in 1999. He was granted immunity in exchange for testimony and never faced criminal charges. Not a single person involved in Operation Midnight Climax was held accountable. The men who were drugged and filmed received no compensation. Most never even knew they'd been unwitting subjects in a government experiment. Operation Sea Spray. If you think dosing men with rainbow papers is bad, wait until you hear what the Navy did to an entire city. In September 1950, the U.S. Navy turned San Francisco into a biological weapon test site. For 6 consecutive days, ships positioned offshore in San Francisco Bay sprayed clouds of bacteria over the city. 800,000 people were exposed, and at least one person died. This was Operation Sea Spray, part of the military's Cold War biological warfare program. The stated purpose was to test the vulnerability of American cities to a Soviet biological attack. The Navy provided the ships and operational support. The Army Chemical Corps, based at Fort Detrick in Maryland, provided the bacterial agents. No one told the city officials, No one told the residents. No one even warned the hospitals to watch for unusual infections. The bacteria they used were Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigi. Serratia produces a distinctive red pigment, which allowed the army to track how far the bacteria spread. The military claimed Serratia was harmless. It's not. We know now that Serratia marcescens can cause serious infections, especially in vulnerable populations like the elderly or immunocompromised. Navy ships used giant hoses mounted on their decks to spray the bacterial suspension into the air. They operated primarily during evening hours when the coastal fog would carry the bacteria inland. For 6 days, from September 20th to September 27th, 1950, they released clouds of bacteria that drifted over San Francisco. Army personnel were stationed throughout the city, collecting air samples and taking surface swabs from buildings and streets to measure how far the bacteria had traveled. Within weeks, Stanford University Hospital reported an unusual cluster of Serratia marcescens infections. 11 patients were hospitalized. Doctors noted it was strange because Serratia infections had been extremely rare before 1950. One of those patients was Edward Nevin III, a 75-year-old man. He was admitted to Stanford Hospital on October 29, 1950, initially diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, but the infection spread. He developed endocarditis, a bacterial infection of the heart valve. On November 1, 1950, Edward Nevin died from Serratia marcescens septicemia. His death certificate listed natural causes. His family had no idea that the military had sprayed bacteria over their city. They wouldn't learn the truth for 26 years. The military considered Operation Sea Spray a success. The data was used for biological warfare vulnerability assessments. The program remained classified. Stanford doctors even published medical reports in 1951 about the unusual cluster of Serratia infections, but they had no knowledge of the military's testing. Operation Sea Spray wasn't an isolated incident. According to Army reports released decades later, the military conducted 239 separate open-air biological agent tests between 1949 and 1969. They tested in multiple cities, including releasing bacteria in the New York City subway system in 1966. The experiments were finally exposed in 1976 and 1977, during the Church Committee era, when Freedom of Information Act requests forced the Army to acknowledge the testing programs. In 1977, Edward Nevin's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the U.S. government. In 1981, a federal judge dismissed the case. The basis was sovereign immunity, the legal principle that the government cannot be sued without its consent. The family received no compensation. No military personnel were prosecuted. No one was disciplined. The offensive biological weapons program was terminated in 1969 by President Nixon, and the Biological Weapons Convention was signed in 1972. But the victims of Operation Sea Spray never received justice. Project Sunshine. At least the people in San Francisco didn't know they were being experimented on. The next victims weren't so lucky, though they couldn't object. They were already dead. Between 1953 and 1957, and continuing into the 1970s, the U.S. government harvested body parts from over 1,500 dead babies without their parents' knowledge or permission. This was Project Sunshine. The Atomic Energy Commission coordinated this program across 3 countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. The purpose was to measure how much strontium-90, a radioactive isotope, children were absorbing from the fallout of atmospheric nuclear testing. The AEC needed bone tissue from young children because their rapidly growing bones were most sensitive to radiation absorption. Here's how it worked. The AEC established relationships with hospitals and morgues across multiple countries. They specifically targeted deceased infants, stillborn babies, and young children, primarily those under 3 years old. Parents were asked to sign general autopsy consent forms. These forms said nothing about tissue removal for radiation research. They didn't mention that body parts would be sent to government laboratories. Parents were told their babies' bodies were needed for routine procedures. What the government took were bone samples, primarily long bones like femurs and tibias. In some cases, they removed entire limbs. One Australian mother discovered decades later that both of her stillborn baby's legs had been removed from the hip down and sent to the United States. Families in the United Kingdom learned their children's spines had been extracted. The bone tissue was then incinerated to ash and analyzed for strontium-90 content. The data was compared against atmospheric nuclear testing records to establish how much radioactive fallout populations were absorbing. The scope was international. Approximately 900 to 1,000 cases in the United States, about 500 in the United Kingdom, around 100 in Australia. The actual total is likely much higher because many records were destroyed or remain classified. The majority of victims were under 6 months old. Many were stillborn or had died within hours of birth. Parents buried what they thought were their children's complete bodies. Some never received complete remains. Project Sunshine remained classified for over 40 years. In 1995, the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, established during the Clinton administration, uncovered documents about the program. When the details became public, the psychological impact on families was severe. Imagine learning 40 years after burying your child that the government had dismembered them for science. The Clinton administration issued a formal apology. The US, UK, and Australian governments all acknowledged the program. Limited symbolic payments were offered to some families who came forward, but there was no comprehensive compensation program. No one was prosecuted. Most of the researchers involved had retired or died by the time Project Sunshine was revealed in 1995. The program contributed to changes in informed consent requirements for research involving human tissues, including tissues from deceased subjects. It established stricter oversight for any research involving body parts and required specific disclosure when tissue would be used for non-medical purposes. But for the families who discovered their children had been mutilated, no policy change could undo what had been done. The Guatemala syphilis experiments. Project Sunshine at least involved people who were already dead. The next experiment deliberately infected living people with deadly diseases, and it happened in another country where the US thought it could get away with it. Between October 1946 and December 1948, the US government intentionally gave 1,300 Guatemalans syphilis and gonorrhea. The lead researcher was Dr. John Charles Cutler, a U.S. Public Health Service physician. And here's the most disturbing part. Cutler would later go on to work on the Tuskegee syphilis study. Same researcher, same ethical violations. The experiments took place in Guatemala City, primarily in the Guatemalan Central Penitentiary, the National Mental Health Hospital, and military barracks. The stated purpose was to test the effectiveness of penicillin as a treatment and preventative for sexually transmitted infections. But there was a reason they conducted these experiments in Guatemala instead of the United States. According to Cutler's own notes, these experiments could not be done in the United States due to ethical concerns. The victims were the most vulnerable populations Guatemala had to offer, approximately 1,300 prisoners who couldn't refuse, about 468 psychiatric patients who couldn't provide informed consent, around 219 soldiers who volunteered under military orders, commercial sex workers, and possibly orphans, though the exact numbers remain unclear. The experiments happened in 2 phases. In the first phase, researchers infected female commercial sex workers with syphilis or gonorrhea, then paid these women to have unprotected sex with male prisoners and soldiers. The infection rate was too low, only about 25%. So Cutler escalated. In phase 2, the doctors moved to direct inoculation. They would abrade the subject's genitals, which means they scratched or cut the skin to create open wounds. Then they poured syphilis bacteria or gonorrhea directly into these wounds. On men, they applied infectious material to the penis, under the foreskin, or onto the shaft. On women, they applied it to the cervix, vaginal walls, or external genitalia. Some subjects had multiple inoculation sites on a single body. They also applied bacterial cultures to mouths, throats, and eyes. They used syringes to inject infectious material into the urethra. In some cases, they created artificial wounds on arms, legs, and faces, then applied the bacteria directly into these cuts. Almost none of these procedures were performed with anesthesia. The victims felt everything. Of the 1,308 people who were intentionally infected, only about 700 received any treatment at all. That means 600 people, approximately 46%, were left completely untreated. Many of the treatments that were given were intentionally inadequate because the researchers wanted to study disease progression. These untreated victims would have developed tertiary syphilis, which causes neurosyphilis, brain and nervous system damage, cardiovascular syphilis affecting the heart, and gummatous syphilis, which destroys tissue. According to the Presidential Commission that investigated the experiments after they were discovered, at least 83 people died during the study period. It's unclear how many of these deaths were directly caused by the experiments versus underlying conditions. But for the 600 people who were never treated, the long-term health impacts would have been devastating. The program was terminated in December 1948. Cutler's notes and reports were filed away in archives and never published in medical journals, which is unusual for supposedly legitimate research. The experiments remained secret for 62 years. In 2010, Professor Susan Reverby, a medical historian at Wellesley College, was researching the Tuskegee syphilis study when she found references to Guatemala work in Cutler's archived papers. She tracked down detailed experimental notes, photographs, and correspondence. When she presented her findings, it caused immediate international outrage. On October 1, 2010, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius issued a formal apology. President Obama personally called the Guatemalan president to apologize. But Dr. John Cutler had died in 2003, 7 years before the discovery. He never faced any consequences. In 2015, Guatemalan survivors and descendants filed a lawsuit in U.S. federal court. The lawsuit was dismissed on sovereign immunity grounds. No compensation was ever provided. Project SHAD. As horrific as the Guatemala experiments were, at least they eventually ended. The next program went on for 12 years and affected 6,000 American military personnel. The U.S. Navy sprayed its own sailors with nerve gas. Sarin, VX, the same chemical weapons designed to cause respiratory failure and death. This was Project SHAD, which stands for Shipboard Hazard and Defense, and it was part of the larger Project 112. From 1962 to 1974, the Department of Defense conducted 134 separate tests on military personnel without their informed consent. The tests took place primarily in the Pacific Ocean, at Johnston Atoll, off the coast of Hawaii, and near Alaska. The program was authorized by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and coordinated by the Army's Deseret Test Center. The stated purpose was to test the effectiveness of chemical and biological weapons and to evaluate defensive equipment like gas masks, protective suits, and decontamination procedures. The victims were active duty military personnel. Approximately 5,000 Navy sailors made up the majority, around 500 to 600 Army personnel, 300 to 400 Marines. These were young men, primarily 18 to 30 years old, who were obligated to follow orders and unable to refuse participation. The sailors were told the tests were routine training exercises or equipment drills. They were not told they would be exposed to chemical warfare agents or biological weapons. They were sworn to secrecy and threatened with court-martial if they disclosed anything. The chemical agents tested included nerve agents like sarin, which causes respiratory failure, convulsions, and death at high doses. VX, the most toxic nerve agent ever developed, lethal in milligram quantities. Tabun, another deadly organophosphate. They also tested blister agents like mustard gas, which causes severe chemical burns, and incapacitating agents like BZ, which causes hallucinations and delirium. The biological agents included Francisella tularensis, which causes tularemia and can be fatal if untreated, Coxiella burnetii, which causes Q fever, and staphylococcal enterotoxin B, a bacterial toxin that causes severe illness. The tests had innocuous code names: Flower Drum, Night Train, Fearless Johnny, Shady Grove. The methods were anything but innocuous. Aircraft would spray chemical agents on ship decks from above, while sailors were ordered to remain on deck. Ships would sail through contaminated aerosol clouds. Agents were released into ship ventilation systems, exposing personnel below deck. In some tests, chemicals were applied directly to ship surfaces, and sailors were ordered to work on the contaminated areas. The protective equipment varied in quality. Some personnel wore gas masks and suits, but some of this equipment was intentionally inadequate because the military wanted to measure failure points. Blood samples were taken before and after some tests, though not consistently. Atropine injections, the antidote for nerve agents, were available, and medical personnel were on standby, but the preventative measures were inadequate by any standard. Decades later, veterans began reporting severe health problems. Neurological disorders like peripheral neuropathy, cognitive impairment, and Parkinson's-like symptoms. Respiratory diseases including chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, and pulmonary fibrosis. Various cancers, leukemia, lymphoma, lung cancer, brain tumors, autoimmune disorders like lupus, and multiple sclerosis. When these sick veterans sought help from the VA, they were told that no such testing had ever occurred. The VA's standard response was that no records existed. The program was officially terminated in 1973 and 1974. Many test documents were destroyed in routine records, purges during the 1970s and 80s. Personnel records often didn't note SHAD participation. For decades, the Department of Defense denied the program existed. In the 1990s, sick veterans began organizing and filing Freedom of Information Act requests. Under congressional pressure, the DoD finally admitted in May 2000 that Project 112 and SHAD had existed. But it wasn't until June 2002 that they released more comprehensive reports acknowledging approximately 134 tests. No one was prosecuted. The Ferris Doctrine, a Supreme Court precedent, bars military personnel from suing the government for injuries incurred during service, even for intentional misconduct. Robert McNamara, who authorized the program, died in 2009. Most commanders and test directors were retired or deceased by the time of disclosure. In 2003, legislation required the DoD to identify all SHAD participants and notify them. The VA began accepting some service-connected disability claims related to SHAD exposures, but many claims are still denied. Veterans bear the burden of proving their illnesses are connected to exposures that happened decades ago, using records that were destroyed or never existed. Many SHAD participants still don't know they were involved. Full declassification remains unlikely, and the true death toll will never be known.